Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And how are you doing? I do hope you're doing fabulously well. And I hope that you're getting ready for the change of season, because I can see that wherever we are, we're getting colder, or in other parts of the world, certainly hotter. So I hope you're keeping yourself lovely and warm. And don't forget to go and get that lovely quintessential drink, because I've got an amazing story for you tonight that you're just going to love. So much love to each and every one of you. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was a gloriously beautiful sunny day in the Blue Ridge Mountains of West Virginia in the summer of 1932, as Mrs. Evangeline Thrift hung out her washing on the line. She glanced up at the vast expanse of the cobalt blue sky, as a white bird soared above her head, towering in the sky like a whimsical children's kite, almost sailing with the wind, as there was a gentle but sweeping breeze blowing that day. I wonder what kind of a bird that is, she thought, placing a wooden peg in her mouth, which she clenched tightly with her teeth. Then she removed it to clasp the far corner of her pretty floral frock. Finally it was hanging on the line, where it blew backwards and forwards in the wind like a gushing sail. Her little Jack Russell Terrier was excitedly tearing around the yard, lifting its leg up on every available bush to mark his territory, as if to tell the entire world, or anyone who might be interested for that matter, that he had been there. As every bush, tree and flower, without discrimination or any form of prejudice, was saturated with his warm, virile essence. Evangeline glanced towards the sparkling, viridescent pretty views that surrounded her, as everywhere you looked there were trees, trees, and still more trees, along with the undulating, sweeping curls of the mountains. Luckily she lived in a neighbourhood where the houses weren't too far apart from each other, where there were exquisite waterfalls, spectacular-looking wood groves, copious amounts of hiking trails, which meant there were so many places to enjoy al fresco picnics in pretty flowery meadows. She sighed happily, whistling a tune to herself as she went into the kitchen, bringing in the large bucket of wild berries she had collected earlier on in the day. Before long Evangeline was buzzing away industriously in her kitchen, preparing dinner for when her husband Simon returned from helping the Godfreys to put up a new wicker fence to prevent their cows from wandering off, as a couple of them had ended up grazing in a neighbour's fields. Fortunately in town her husband was always picking up odd jobs from the locals, and there was a note up in the baker's window saying, "Simon Thrift, handyman services available. No job too big or too small. Available on Mondays to Saturdays." By the time dinner had come and gone, Evangeline was beginning to worry about her husband. Where the heck had he got to, she wondered to herself, her forehead furrowing into deep worry lines. Should she be concerned, she wondered, or had her husband been sidetracked by one of the locals? Was he enjoying a little chinwag and a stiff tot of whisky? She certainly hoped the latter was the case, and almost suspected as much. All of a sudden she heard the familiar whizzing sound of her husband's bicycle riding down the path towards their farmhouse, followed by the habitual customary thumping sound of the bike being placed haphazardly against the yard shed. Then she heard the squeaking sound of familiar boots, finally heading towards the back door that led towards the kitchen. It creaked wide open, and standing there as a dense, dark, shadowy silhouette in the twilight stood the tall, distinguishable figure of her husband. A fragrant relief infused her heart gratefully. She was so glad that Simon was safely back, but ever so slightly aggrieved at the same time, as he had left her feeling more than a little concerned. "Where have you been, Simon? Your dinner is now stone cold." Simon sat back on the quirky green gold-stripe upholstered chair in the far corner of the kitchen, lifting his boots up to his knees, untying the tangled laces, throwing them across the kitchen floor in a messy heap, a habit that Evangeline did not approve of, but she always bit her lip tightly, saying nothing. She didn't want to become the quintessential nagging wife that the Bible always referred to as being worse than a dripping tap. "Oh, that's much better," he sighed, rubbing his toes through his socks briefly, massaging the underside of his feet. "It's been one hell of a day. Is there anything to eat? I'm half starved. I could eat an entire turkey." Evangeline bustled towards the stove to warm up a piece of meatloaf drenched in a plethora of gravy for her husband, which she served with biscuits. He ate hungrily, not saying a word, barely stopping to draw breath between ravenous mouthfuls. She couldn't help but notice that her young husband looked frazzled, worn out, jaded, exhausted even, which was unusual for him, as he normally was buzzing with life like a hyperactive bee. But not tonight. He was different this evening. "How did the installation go with the wicker fence?" she asked. "Did you complete the job?" "It didn't go at all," said her husband. "A little girl visiting from the Big Apple went missing on a family picnic. The family were visiting friends who lived here, so they're not familiar or acquainted with the area. The girl was playing by the creek with her brother, only a few feet away from the adults, who were able to keep a vigilant eye on both of their kids. The little boy got distracted by a frog, was chasing after it to put in a bottle. When he turned around to show his sister his fabulous conquest, she had all but vanished. According to the family, 1 minute she was there, the next she was gone. Everyone in town was scaling the forest in a dreadful concern, but we found no sign of her. The whole family is completely devastated, while the boy is naturally terribly upset. Sadly, he blames himself. No one can fathom what could have happened to her, for during our search we found nothing. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Everyone is naturally feeling very downcast. I can't imagine the grief the poor family is going through. The mother wouldn't stop screaming. You should have seen her. She was so distressed. Dr. Adams had to be called to sedate her." "And you're sure they looked absolutely everywhere? I mean, they didn't see some suspicious lowlife loitering around, or even a predatory mountain lion, perhaps? Something must have happened to her. You don't just disappear into thin air like that. You'd have expected to find some clues, surely." "Well, the family did say that when they arrived for the picnic, they saw a family of Roma gypsies with their wagon and horses parked outside the hiking trail. But after the young girl went missing, they were long since gone. So there is idle speculation that they might have been behind the kid's abduction. Suffice to say, those Roma gypsies are renowned for making mischief. We all know that very well. By all accounts, according to the boy's father, they looked more than a little shady, as if they were up to no good. I wish they'd go back to Eastern Europe. What are they doing out here in America? This is our country, our fine country. Why should we be invaded by all these migrants?" "So you saw no other clues, like a torn piece of fabric perhaps on a hedgerow, or something from the little girl?" "No, but we did see something very weird. We discovered in some of the muddy areas around the creek 18-inch footprints that were over 9 inches wide. Now I ask you, Evangeline, who has got feet that huge? There is no way those were bear prints. There were discernible toes on the print, very distinctive human toes." "But that's enormous! Who's got feet that big, apart from a circus clown when they wear those oversized shoes?" "Well, one of the locals said it could be a footprint from a hairy mountain giant. He believes there is a distinct possibility that a creature like that could have abducted the young girl. They're rumoured to live in the heart of the mountains, but from what I've gathered, they're benevolent. They have no real desire to interact with humans. My money's on the Roma gypsies. I'm certain they abducted her. They're behind her mysterious disappearance. I'm sure of it. The trouble is there's no way of tracking them. They've disappeared into the ether, never to be seen or heard from again. You know what those gypsies are like." "Hairy mountain giant," said Evangeline, looking nonplussed. "Well, I never. I've heard everything now." This happened 10 years before my grandmother was born. Evangeline was my mother Rachel's birth mother. The story of the missing girl that vanished 10 years prior had long since been extinguished, like the flame from a candle. Well, so it seemed. My grandmother was raised by Evangeline and Simon Thrift in a white symmetrical farmhouse with a pretty green trim, with a columned portico overlooking the stunning views of the Blue Mountains. They lived in a close-knit convivial community where everyone was well acquainted with each other. When my mother Rachel, Evangeline's oldest daughter, was 12 years old, a strange man moved into town. Everyone was talking about it, because, well, he wasn't from the Blue Mountains, so he stuck out like a sore thumb. The family was soon to learn that he'd moved into the late Miss Schreiner's farmhouse a little further down the road from the Thrift family home. I guess you could say he was in his late 20s or early 30s. Rachel had seen him at church one Sunday being welcomed to the town by the local pastor, who introduced the startled man to his entire flock. It would appear people were friendly towards him, but his attitude was oddly aloof and indifferent. It would seem tongues were wagging in the town faster than a feisty dog's tail, as people pondered as to who he was, what he was doing in town, why he was even there. I mean, why would someone from the Big Apple move to a small, remote, rural mountain town? "I don't know why everybody finds this so peculiarly odd," Evangeline had said over the dinner table one night, when mention of the new man in town was being discussed over dinner. As my mother Rachel and her brother Elijah listened in to the conversation, while they tucked hungrily into hearty bowls of beef stew and dumpling. "You know, it's perfectly natural for a writer to move to a beautiful part of the world," Evangeline was saying. "It's all about stimulating the flow of the creative juices. It invariably enables the writer to think of more inspirational subject matter, as ideas always flow so much easier in an aesthetically pleasing environment." "I suppose that makes sense," said Simon, rubbing his moustache reflectively. "But why our part of the world?" "Well, why not? Why not our part of the world?" Evangeline had challenged him. "Why ever not? It's very exquisite around here, I'll have you know. We have the crisp mountain air, sensational views, pretty flowery meadows, mountains. What's there not to like about this part of the world?" "Of course it's a beautiful part of the world, sweetheart. I agree. But why would he want to move to a small mountain town? He seems so conspicuous among the locals. A real fish out of the water, you could say. I'm sure he must feel it too. A little like an oddball coming from a big city like New York." "If you don't mind my saying so, Simon, you're being ridiculous. We don't have to be so parochial, insular, narrow-minded around here, do we? If a stranger wants to move into our midst, we need to make him feel welcome, not regard him with an obnoxious, illiberal suspicion. People around here need to be a little less provincial, much more open-minded. I'd hope if I moved to another American town that I'd also be made to feel welcome, or even a city like New York for that matter. Although I dare say I would look like a little country bumpkin if I moved to New York. They're so much more sophisticated out there." "It's not that, sweetheart. I guess there's something about this stranger that's a little, well, shall we say, idiosyncratic." "I'll have you know, Simon, his name is Hugo Yarborough. It would be very nice if you could address the man courteously by his name. The only thing you find outlandish about him is he's refreshingly eccentric, and what's wrong with that? Would you discriminate against a Rhode Island red chicken if I introduced him to our Brahmas and Plymouth Rocks, just because he's different? Why, the notion is absolutely ridiculous." "It's not the same thing." "Well then, why is he peculiar to you?" "Well, a couple of the locals have seen him wandering around the woods, behaving very, very strangely." "Oh, for goodness sake, Simon! Have people here not got anything better to do than fill their minds with this flaky, bubble-headed, preposterous reasoning? The poor man was possibly just exploring the countryside. What on earth is wrong with that? Give him a break, for goodness sake." One day my mother Rachel, who was 12 at the time, while her brother Elijah was 11, were both ambling down the country lane together. They happened to pass Mr. Yarborough at the very moment when he was driving out of his property in his dark green 1950s station wagon. They watched him driving down the precarious dirt road that was covered in potholes and lots of rocky debris, so the car invariably jiggled and jolted as it drove away, until it was just a shadowy speck on the horizon, or a faint speck of dust on the landscape. "Do you think he saw us?" Rachel whispered to her brother earnestly. "Does it even matter if he did?" asked Elijah. "We're just having a walk. Nothing uncustomary about that, surely." "I suppose not. Let's go and have a snoop around his property now that he's out the way. Maybe a door will be open somewhere. We can take a quick peek inside." "Go on, Elijah, it'll be fun. Aren't you just a teensy-weensy bit curious about the man? See if any of his novels are lying around the place. Mum thinks he might write murder mysteries. Wouldn't that be cool if we actually had a famous novelist in our midst? Murder mysteries! It doesn't get better than that. I bet you he's writing under an unassumed name. All right, agreed Elijah. I'm game. Let's do it. As Rachel and her brother Elijah reached the classic minimalistic farmhouse, it didn't appear unsimilar to their own. It was pretty, modest, a white symmetrical wooden two-storey building with clean angular lines, a central porch that led directly to a pale blue front door. There was a long row of sashed windows on the upper and lower stories, arrayed in a perfect uniform sequence, all framed by attractive large shutters that looked like they cost a pretty penny, that were painted in a pale blue trim, while the roof of the house boasted a standard grey slate tile. It was so typical of a quintessential 1950s farmhouse, as there were no pretentious ornamentations or embellishments to the house, which expressed a straightforward, uncomplicated simplicity. An old, congenial, very friendly mixed-breed dog that looked like a mixture of Pyrenees Mountain and Labrador had been lying on the porch in an oversized basket. He exuberantly came bounding towards them, thrashing his tail backwards and forwards with an enthusiastic gusto, letting out the occasional excitable woof that expressed his extreme pleasure in encountering the two young trespassers. So a guard dog he was most certainly not. On the contrary, he was the kind of dog that would have invited an intruder into the home with a gleeful appreciation, not batting an eyelid if the entire house had been ramshackled and everything stolen. Rachel bent down to cuddle the dog, soaking her small fingers into his soft, long fur, while her brother Elijah darted swiftly up the steps of the porch, pressing open the creaking front door that sounded as though it hadn't been oiled in many years. "It's open. We can have a good snoop." The front door opened out into a neat little entrance hall, which was painted in a grandiose vintage red colour, while a large abstract piece of art took central stage on the wall. There was a couple of smart upholstered gold and red striped chairs, and a small chestnut table sporting a vase of freshly cut summer flowers. The entrance hall opened out into a living room that was very cheerful for a young bachelor, boasting bright aquamarine walls, along with gold-coloured couches covered in a mirage of bright scatter cushions in different colours and designs, while on the wall were some framed pieces of colourful artwork, along with bookshelves bursting at the seams with books. There was a large, extravagant Persian rug gracing the wooden parquet floor, done in rich golds and reds, along with an eclectic light fitting dangling from the ceiling that looked much more like a contemporary work of art than a light fitting at all. "I'll give you this," whispered Rachel. "For a man living on his own as a bachelor, he hasn't half got good taste." It was when the two kids gravitated towards a room overlooking pretty views in the front yard. They stopped dead in their tracks. There was a lone typewriter on a desk with some paper inside it and words written on the page, which Rachel bent down to read out loud. "He's definitely a writer. Listen to this, Elijah." We stood at the turning point. Half measures availed us nothing. "And then look further down, it says, 'Murder filled us with a sense of dread, which didn't bode well with Madame de Bois.' I told you, I think he writes thrillers." "Look at this," said Elijah, opening up a large paper book filled with strange articles, along with pictures of a young blonde girl with blue eyes playing with a bucket and spade on a sandy beach, making sandcastles with a slightly older kid that looked like her brother. The newspaper article read, "Melissa Yarborough, a young 8-year-old girl, went missing on Saturday when picnicking with her family on the mountain farm trail that is easily accessible to members of the public. Mr. Yarborough affirmed that he and his family were picnicking in the wood grove opposite a pretty little creek. Our eyes were on the kids the whole time," he informed the Bluefield Sunset News. "The kids were playing around in the water. My son Hugo was catching a frog. When he turned around, his sister had gone, vanished into thin air. It happened so fast," said Mr. Yarborough. "It was like she completely disappeared off the face of the earth. A search party with hundreds of locals succeeded not in finding the missing girl, but postulating conjectures abounded, as Roma gypsies purported to have been parked close to the trail conveniently had absconded. Furthermore, things got exceedingly more bizarre to this intriguing outlandish case, as trails of freshly made oversized footprints that some hypothesize could belong to an elusive hairy mountain giant that is rumoured to inhabit the mountains were seen in a muddy location not far from where the child vanished. So what did happen to Melissa Yarborough is open to speculation, this mystery leaving many with more answers than questions. "Wow!" said Rachel, looking at her brother Elijah with wide, aghast eyes. "Don't you see? Hugo Yarborough must be the brother of the little girl that went missing around here. Look at the date. This happened in the 1930s, 20 years ago. I remember Mum telling me about a young girl going missing on that mountain farm trail. Don't you remember?" "That's weird," said Elijah. "Why would the girl's brother come back here?" Rachel surfed through the paper book to discover articles written about anomalous sightings of mountain giants in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It read, "Large footprints, not that of a bear, measuring 20 inches, have been spotted in remote wooded areas after heavy rainfall by hikers and hunters alike. Some claim to have seen a sighting of a giant humanoid-like beast, covered with long dark hair with gargantuan proportions that might even challenge the width and height of your front door. And we're not joking either." Mrs. Lacey Penbridge told the Post, "I've seen one myself when berry picking last summer. It was like a huge human being, but covered in hair. It watched me as it hid behind a large beech tree, but I saw it very clearly. Even if it was only for a minute, I know what I saw. Miss Penbridge is in no doubt what she saw. So is there a hairy giant-like beast living among us in the Blue Mountains? You decide." "Think about it, Elijah. Maybe Hugo thinks his sister's still alive somewhere, was abducted by a mountain giant, is living in a cave somewhere. Or maybe he just wants to be close to where his sister was last seen all those years ago. That's maybe why he came to this town. But I would questimate that he came here not just to write his books." "Wow, that's seriously weird," said Elijah. "And as for those fictitious so-called mountain giants, are they even real? My money's on those gypsies. They took her away. I'm certain of it." "Let's go," said Rachel suddenly. "We don't want that Hugo man to discover us ferreting around in his business." Many weeks passed, and Rachel and Elijah soon forgot about Mr. Hugo Yarborough. Before long the town began to find other things to gossip about, besides the slick, rather quirky character from the Big Apple that had settled in their part of the world, and was as out of place in West Virginia as a Kentucky pawpaw tree inhabiting the sub-zero conditions of the Alaskan wilderness. Regardless, however incongruous and incompatible to their town he may have seemed, after a while even the out-of-ordinary has a remarkable ability of settling into an environment so that in no time at all the outlandish seems almost normal. It would seem the locals got used to Mr. Yarborough frequenting the town, buying bread from the baker, beef from the butcher, sugar from the grocers, and attending church every Sunday. But despite the offer of warm convivial hospitality that many of the generous locals extended graciously towards him, it would seem that Hugo Yarborough remained elusive, evasive, indifferent, as if caught up in a world of his own making. As Rachel's mother Evangeline had explained, "Why don't the locals stop putting the knife in the poor man? Stop taking offence when he says no to a barbecue invitation. Let the poor man breathe. He's a writer, for goodness sake. He needs to clear his mind of the clutter of everyday life, to open up the doors of inspirational creative ideas. Why doesn't anybody get that?" It was one day when Rachel and Elijah were walking down the country lane, when over across the embankment on the opposite side of the dirt road, standing on the edge of the forested woodgrove, who should they see but the silhouette of Mr. Hugo Yarborough? They could sense by his fixed demeanour, purposeful stride, along with the Winchester rifle he was carrying in his hands, that he was up to something curious, which ignited their attentions, sparking up their inquisitive curiosity. It was on a spontaneous, somewhat irrational, unfortuitous whim they decided to surreptitiously follow Mr. Yarborough through the hardwood forest made up of sugar maples, beeches, birches, red and white oak trees. It was an exquisitely idyllic summer's day, as prisms of sparkling, twinkling sunlight infused the forest with an ethereal, soft, gleaming light that danced through the boughs of the trees, casting pretty shadows on the viridescent ferns, along with the verdant wildbrush that grew wildly across the forest floor. along with some rather gnarled ropey roots that spiralled unevenly across the earthen surface that, although visually attractive to the eye, certainly had the potential to trip you off your feet so that you could easily lose your footing and take a very nasty fall. Birds trilled, warbled, whistled and tweeted in the trees as the two children cautiously followed Hugo into the heart of the woods. There were times he was bending down on his knees, thoroughly examining the ground, as though he was stalking something, following a trail of some kind. Once Hugo advanced past the dirty, muddy patch, the children quickly stealthily ambled over to the area that he'd been examining moments before, that due to recent rain showers had become muddy, making the ground precariously slippery, another sure way to guarantee a nasty fall. Then Rachel and her brother gasped as they saw a huge footprint in the mud that was distinctly human-like, but it couldn't have been, measuring 18 inches. The two children placed their feet into the large print that made their feet look like they were wearing doll shoes. They were gobsmacked, thrown off guard, for they had not expected to see something as outlandish as this. "Oh my God," said Elijah, who naturally knew a great deal about the natural world, even at such a young, tender age, as his father had taught him so much in his young life. "These footprints are fresh," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "If this is made by an erroneous mountain giant, that is, if those things are in fact real, then he or she is very close by." "You think so?" said Rachel, looking incredulous. They could see the figure of Hugh Yarborough ducking down behind some shrubbery, as if he was laying low for a moment, biding his time, waiting, listening, and clearly stalking something. Could he be stalking this thing that had made the massive footprint in the mud? It seemed more than likely. Rachel and Elijah moved through the trees with the stealthful, nimble proficiency and cunning agility of an accomplished mountain lion, so much so that Hugo Yarborough was none the wiser to their presence. In a trice the forest became very quiet, awkwardly still, and then a few tree branches began to shake and jiggle. And then suddenly, sauntering through the trees, standing only feet away from Hugo Yarborough, were two mountain giants, both male, who were clearly arguing about something. Rachel held her breath, hardly daring to breathe, while her heart pounded violently in her chest at 100 miles an hour. For never in her entire life, nor in her wildest dreams, had she anticipated such a bizarre sighting as this. If she were an adult, she might have thought she'd engaged in some moonshine, so her mind was deceiving her. But she knew she was as sober as the sunny day, neither intoxicated or delusional. Besides, one look at her brother's stupefied reaction told her that her eyes were not teasing her, for her brother's brown eyes had grown as wide as saucers, which affirmed to her that he too was seeing what she was perceiving. For indeed the legend of the mountain giants was no hoax. It was real. Was she afraid? No, she wasn't. She didn't feel any fear, for she didn't feel the heightened level of panic that you would expect from fear. Yet she should have been afraid, shouldn't she? I mean, these things were exceedingly intimidating, massive in size, easily over 10 foot tall, burly, powerful, majestic, lofty, utterly gargantuan, built like a farmer's tractor that would dwarf most animals. In her eyes they were exceedingly beautiful, magnificent, extraordinary, clearly apex predators, for she seriously doubted that a mountain lion would be a threat to a creature like this. The creatures were strikingly human, but built in man's image on a gigantic scale, although the skulls were more like a pyramid shape, and they were suspended low on the heavy shoulders. But the faces, oh my word, those faces, they were uncannily human. No doubt about it at all, with high cheekbones, deep-set dark eyes, square masculine jawlines, aquatic flat noses. All Rachel could feel was butterflies floating around in her stomach. "Oh my God," whispered Elijah to her. "They're beautiful, angry, but beautiful." Rachel agreed wholeheartedly, while both remained steadfastly inconspicuous to avoid being detected. The two mountain giants were clearly male. They were having a real balmy, not unlike two pugnacious children. It was their juvenile behaviour that made Rachel assume that despite their gargantuan proportions, these creatures were still reasonably young. The two creatures stood facing each other, their elevated voices expressing a level of indignancy, as they chatted backwards and forwards in an audible language that Rachel had never heard before, There was a lot of finger-pointing, as much like humans, the creatures were clearly challenging each other. Imagine for a moment listening to two people in foreign language engaged in an altercation of some kind. You may not comprehend a single word they're saying, but based on the tonal of their voice, with its raised resonances and barking snaps, you would be left in no doubt that they were clearly fighting. It was no different on this occasion. Rachel was left with a distinct impression that these two mountain giants were definitely brothers, possibly even twins, although she couldn't be sure. But they were having a huge disagreement. Although angry with each other, the altercation was not physical, which certainly suggested a level of emotional intelligence that was pretty impressive. Her perceptive, astute, diligent eyes glanced towards the hidden figure of Mr. Hugh Yarborough, who was cocking his rifle at the creatures, his fingers pulling back the lever to fire a shot. "No!" she screamed. "No, don't shoot!" She ran out of her hiding place towards Mr. Yarborough. "Don't shoot, Mr. Yarborough! Please, I beg you, don't shoot! Don't shoot!" The two creatures had stopped fighting. Their deep-set brown eyes were nonplussed as they focused on Rachel running through the undergrowth towards a strange man hankering low in the bushes. No one was more astonished than Mr. Yarborough, who stared at Rachel in horror. For a long moment he was lost for words. "Mr. Yarborough, you can't shoot those two mountain giants!" "I know what you're thinking, Mr. Yarborough. You think they're responsible for abducting your sister all those years ago." Mr. Yarborough looked astonished. "You know about that?" Rachel nodded. "I know about it all, Mr. Yarborough. That's why you came back to this town. You came to seek your revenge. You wanted to kill one of those giants in retaliation for your sister going missing. That would be morally reprehensible, Mr. Yarborough. That would be intrinsically wrong. Those creatures, they weren't even born when your sister was alive. They may be big, but they're very young." "But it was one of those mountain giants that abducted my sister. I know it! I know it!" "Really?" said Rachel, putting her hands on her hips defiantly, surprising herself by how like Evangeline, her mother, she sounded. "How do you know that, Mr. Yarborough? How could you possibly know that? My mother would describe that as hearsay. You have no tangible proof. It would never ever stand up in a court of law." "Footsteps were seen around the creek when my sister was abducted. Big footprints that could have only belonged to a mountain giant. And I have heard stories from indigenous people about girls being abducted by these beasts." "Mr. Yarborough, that could be a coincidence," piped my brother. "It doesn't mean that a mountain giant actually stole or even abducted your sister. I heard there was a gypsy wagon spotted near the site where your sister mysteriously disappeared. If you don't mind my saying, Mr. Yarborough, I believe you're barking up the wrong tree, as my dad would say." "You children are remarkably astute, very mature for one so young," said Mr. Yarborough, sighing in resignation, relaxing the rifle in his hands. "I concede you do argue a very profound case, but I still have to say I'm exceedingly doubtful." The two mountain giants had not flinched for a single moment, but stood still as statues, while Rachel continued to deliberate with Mr. Yarborough, and she was good, as she helped him to see how crazy his behaviour was. "Apart from anything else, Mr. Yarborough, if you shot one of those creatures, the other one would almost certainly kill you in seconds. I don't doubt that for a moment. It would be a natural reaction, and you couldn't blame them either. I would do the same if I was in their shoes, and you killed my brother. I'd never let you get off scot-free. Never in a million years. These creatures are intelligent. Can't you see that?" Rachel turned around to face the two creatures, who for some extraordinary reason hadn't moved away. They appeared to be studying Rachel, her brother, and of course the strange man that was cowering behind the tree. She spoke to the mountain giants in audible English, almost as if she expected them to understand her every word. "I must apologise for Mr. Yarborough. You see, he's a very, very sad man." The creature's eyes were fixed on Rachel as she spoke. "He's sad because his sister was abducted over 20 long years ago from this very woods. He was going to shoot at you because, well, he thought a mountain giant had stolen his sister. He wanted revenge. Please don't be cross with him. He's not going to hurt you now." The most extraordinary thing happened. The two young mountain giants nodded at Rachel, gave Hugo a sombre glance. Then they turned around, gliding away, moving so gracefully it looked like they were floating. Rachel was convinced, as absurd as it sounds, that those two mountain giants comprehended her very words. "It's hard to explain," she'd said. "It was like they were telepathic. Certainly when they saw me thundering out of the bushes like that, they got the shock of their lives, but they were incredibly curious about the enigmatic situation, that they wanted to make sense of it somehow. One thing is for certain, I put a stop to that petty squabble of theirs. They were so benevolent, non-aggressive. I didn't feel remotely afraid." I'm glad to inform you that Hugo Yarborough had allowed two young kids to make him finally see sense, when he realised it was indeed irrational to lash out at a couple of benign mountain giants that had absolutely nothing to do with the abduction of his sister. Before long, he ingratiated himself with the residents of the mountain town, beginning to accept invitations to barbecues and social engagements. The man, who at first seemed out of place, became a much-loved fixture and fitting in the small town, loved by many, while his detective novels were flying off the shelves, but his published name must be kept anonymous for the purposes of this story. One day, when Evangeline was 16 years old, there was a knock at the farmhouse door. Her mother, Evangeline, glanced at the kitchen clock. It was 7 o'clock at night. Who would be calling at this late hour, she wondered, scurrying off quickly to open the door. Who should be standing there in the doorway but Hugo Yarborough, along with a woman who looked extraordinarily like him, with a similar long face, a distinguished jawline, along with a long mane of blonde hair. "Sorry to pop around so late," he explained. "I'd like to see Rachel and Elijah, if I may." "Of course," said my mother. Elijah, come down, will you? Bring your sister with you. We've got guests. They want to see you." "Take a seat," said my mother, directing her guests into the living room, where they gratefully sat down on the upholstered chairs. For a second, Rachel thought that maybe Hugo was about to introduce them to his new fiancée. "I'd like to introduce you to my sister Melissa, who went missing a long time ago." Evangeline gasped, while Rachel and Elijah stared in awe at the woman. "You're the missing girl? The one that went missing all those years ago?" The woman nodded. I don't understand," blubbered Rachel. "How's this even remotely possible? What happened to you? You disappeared into thin air. Nobody knew where you went." The woman smiled. "My name is Esmeralda Perron," she exclaimed. "I always believed, or rather should I say accepted, that I was a Roma gypsy, until my grandmother told me the truth after my mother passed away unfortuitously last year. She told me that one day their caravan and horses were parked outside a well-known hiking trail. Apparently my mother took one look at the fair-haired little me running through the woodgrove and thought I was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. She said to her brother, 'I want that little girl to be my own.' And her brother, my uncle, went and abducted me. You see, my mother had been trying for years with her husband to have a baby, but it seemed she was infertile, so she raised me as her own, after which she subsequently did have 3 more daughters, so she wasn't sterile after all. Of course, I have no recollection of living a different life other than the one that I have led as a Roma gypsy, as I was abducted so young. Of course, I knew I was different to the rest of my family. I mean, that was clear. They all had deeply tanned skin, brown eyes, distinctive Eastern European looks, while I was blonde with blue eyes, so of course my parents literally lied to me. They told me they'd found me abandoned on the side of the road when I was very young. I believed that lie for a long time, falsely assuming that my parents didn't want me. I despised white people, loathed the fact that I looked like an American, not a Roma gypsy. One day my grandmother told me the truth. She felt I had the right to know where I came from. She did tell me that if I was to trace my real family, I mustn't give the rest of the gypsy clan away. Not to the law, that is, and of course I never will. You see, despite everything else, I still consider myself a Roma gypsy. I had an excellent childhood. I couldn't have asked for more loving parents. I would never want them to get into trouble about what happened. Besides, I'm going back to my life in the wagon. It's all I've ever known. Anyway, I did my research, and I'm pleased to be reacquainted with my brother Hugo, she said, reaching out to squeeze his hand affectionately. I am so glad we found each other. We will never ever lose touch. Not now. Which is why I came around at once, said Hugo, to thank you both personally for speaking so much sense to me in the woods when I nearly killed those 2 innocent mountain giants a few years back. Imagine having that on my conscience now. I was sure the elusive mountain giants were responsible for my sister's abduction. But all the time you were absolutely right, Elijah. You perceive the gypsies abducted my sister. You were absolutely on to the money there." "Well, I never," said Evangeline, blotting the tears away from her eyes. "This is a turn-up for the books. What a remarkable story." The newspaper seemed to agree, as an article read, "Missing persons case finally solved from 1932. Little Melissa Yarborough has returned to her family safe and well, after having been abducted by Roma gypsies from a hiking trail during a family picnic when she disappeared over 25 years ago. The young woman, who calls herself Esmeralda, refuses to give details about her abductors, but has only come forward to connect with her blood relatives. Having been asked by the Beckley Herald how she felt about her abductors, she said, 'I love them with all my heart. I see myself as an authentic Roma gypsy, and I believe, despite everything, this was the life that God ordained for me. I have no regrets to what happened all those years ago, only hurt and anguish about what my biological family must have gone through as a result of my abduction. But I cannot apologize for how I feel, as I remain always a Roma gypsy in my heart.'" This was a story that was shared with me by my mother Rachel, who has long since passed away, along with the memories of this incredulous event, of which she shared with me when I was a young girl, describing it to me as the quintessential, most extraordinary experience of her entire young life. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.